My honor to welcome everybody to the Accenture Innovation Studio today. And then my next privilege is actually to welcome and introduce a good friend and a good colleague, and also one of the leading minds in the space of workforce and workforce development. Somebody who's been studying the issues around the gig economy, around the changing nature of our economy, about our ability to compete as a region, but also as a country, who is one of the best and brightest and most compassionate minds about what the workforce of the future has to look like and what is going to be necessary for us to compete in the years ahead. And so with that, the senior senator from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mark Warner.
much better than the shoe. Much better than the shoe hand.
Yes, exactly.
Well, thank you, Marty. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your great work and Accenture's great work. I mean, some of the ideas I'm going to be talking about in a few moments. Marty and his team were early contributors, early workers, and helped, frankly, gin up a lot of these ideas. Let me also thank my dear friend Byron, Auguste, and everybody at Opportunity at Work for the great work that's gone into this study. This is a critically important time, and while this was not how we were originally planning on doing this event, and it's going to be a little more difficult for me on some of my factoids that I may have here. I can't hide the fact that I've got a cheat sheets, but so be the case. But in many ways, and I'll get to this in a moment, on a lot of the issues, particularly around gig workers, particularly around workers with no social insurance. Byron, Marty, others have been talking about the notion that this part of our economy may be doing on a current cash flow basis. But I've always said that when stuff hits the fan, as it always does, these folks will have nothing to fall back on. Now, I would have never predicted that it would have been a pandemic that would have been this initial stuff hitting the fan, but it is happening real time for literally millions and millions of workers right now. And one of the reasons why I'm going to make this presentation and then zip back to my day job, Congress may, at least the House will, and I would hope the Senate will, if need be, stay in session to take up these issues to make sure that we give that immediate relief to the literally tens of millions of Americans that over the coming days and weeks may be hit with the kind of lack of ability to work or self-quarantine or industries that are being disproportionately affected. And we need to be there for them in a way that targets that relief, particularly in the first stage of this crisis, to the affected workers and their families. But back to the main event, and that main event is the release of this STAR report that highlights this category of workers who have been able to acquire skills not necessarily through traditional means. And for literally decades, many of us in policymaking roles have made the comments that, the path to a good life in America doesn't necessarily have to be through a traditional four-year college. We've talked about it, but we've not really put the kind of rigor and study into showing that that is actually taking place and that wide swaths of the American workforce falls into that cohort. With this report, 71 million workers, a huge portion of our workforce who are skilled through alternative routes. And we've got to make sure that we continue to advance that and lay out other alternatives. As I mentioned, we're seeing some of those workers being hit with the coronavirus right now, an area that I focused on in gig workers and the failure to have any kind of benefit background. The good news is that we have been in contact with many of those platform companies. They are making initial first steps. And while I appreciate the fact that there may be a couple weeks of paid leave for folks who get the coronavirus or who are forced into quarantine, that is necessary but not sufficient. So my appeal to the platforms is work with us, work with others. There is more to be done. And I would argue that we're not asking for anything rash, that most of the immediate time of post-World War II capitalism in this country. There was a type of capitalism that I would call more stakeholder capitalism, simply rather than shareholder-only focused capitalism, where for literally decades, when capitalism took in America more people out of poverty than at any point, and again, it was a capitalism that still was not fair on a racial basis, that was not fair on a sexism basis, but still, and gross numbers took literally millions out of poverty. It was a capitalism that where companies were able to say, yes, I want to do well for my shareholders, but I also want to do well for my stakeholders, my employees, the community we're vested in. And candidly, I think we need, at a macro level, to get back to that. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But as we all know, and partially driven by technology, partially driven by the speed of the movements of capital, that kind of capitalism got replaced by an enormous, and I would argue, disproportionate focus on shareholder value only, and in particular, short-term shareholder appreciation. That would take precedence over anything else. And increasingly, companies focused, in terms of the workforce, only on those workers that were absolutely core to their mission. And consequently, every other job, and disproportionately these jobs are low and moderate income jobs, got basically outsourced, either literally or figuratively. Outsourced abroad, or outsourced where someone that was a prior worker within the company structure became an outside consultant or contractor, which sounds good at first blush, but in reality proved to be an awful outcome. And I still think about the story back in the New York Times a couple years ago about, I think most of us who follow this space probably remember reading it, about the two janitors. One lady who started as a janitor at Kodak. While she was a Kodak employee, she continued to be a janitor, learned skills, got the benefits of being a Kodak employee, and literally ended her career as the CTO of Kodak. Somebody that came in at one of the lower rungs in the corporate structure, would not have been normally tracked to even get into management, let alone senior management, but her skills were able to shine through, and she became that success. On the other hand, a company that we all salute and applaud, Apple, took that same janitor a number of years back, and or that same classification of janitor, and said, we're not going to make you an Apple employee with all the benefits and opportunities that come with that. You're going to be an outside contractor. And they took an Apple janitor that had been almost the same equivalent amount of time working for Apple. And unfortunately, the story was this individual was making only a few dollars more per hour, literally 15 to 20 years into employment, and had no benefits, had no additional training, had no security. That's not fair. It's not right. And I think it, again, drills home this report that if we're going to make sure there's any level of opportunity, equality of opportunity, we really have to take a look at this star cohort of workers in our workforce. And the challenge particularly is that of this 71 million, about 18 million, based upon the good work of this report, are workers that have actually acquired additional skills through these alternative routes. So they have acquired the skills that should put them higher in the food chain in terms of pay, benefits, and responsibility. That is a great talent that at this point is, for the most part, being ignored by corporate America. That is a mistake. Matter of fact, just 5 million, 1 in 3 of those folks that have acquired the additional skills have moved out of low and moderate income jobs into high wage jobs. Yet there's still this cohort with people with additional skills that aren't getting recognized. We've got to make sure that we do a better job of that mismatch. So I applaud the report and all the work. I know we've got a lot of folks in this room here who did the hard work to give us this data that I hope to take up to Congress, to my colleagues in Congress, and share with them. This is an issue that has no Democrat or Republican or left, right. This makes moral sense. It makes economic sense. We all know one of the real challenges has been how we meet the human capital needs to the business needs. Well, we've got some examples right here. And one of the things that I think the report pointed out is a lot of the inefficiencies and barriers to those 12 million folks who've already got the skills, or the literally close to 55 million Americans that are in this category that could be on the pathway to those skills if we can get rid of some of those economic inefficiencies. So whether that is Pell Grant for industry certifications, whether that is tools to make sure that we provide more training in the workplace, whether it is valuing skills that someone may have acquired in the military before they come into the corporate world. There are a host of tools that this report points out that I think that we need to grapple with. Final comment I want to make is just this. And Byron and I did a brief conversation on this before I came up. While I applaud the work that was in this document, and I again intend to take it and share it with my colleagues, I do think for a moment, as we look at how, from a public policy standpoint, we deal with some of the constraints that our economy faces. We have this moment, unpredicted as it was, with not only a healthcare crisis, but a healthcare crisis that I think is morphing into an economic crisis. My hope is that certain basic rights, like paid sick leave, will become a reality in the immediate short term, for example, coming out of this crisis. But I also hope there will be a little more emphasis right now that we take a step back and with the presidential elections in front of us, but hopefully in a bipartisan way, say, how can we make modern American capitalism actually work for more people? Let me leave you with three quick areas that I would hope could be subject to further discussion and study. First, and I've mentioned this around the gig workforce, but it's much larger than the gig workforce. Wide swaths of the American workforce today are not going to work in traditional employment in a single job. I always point out the way my dad did for 38 years in the same company. He never made a lot of money, but with that job came certain security in terms of health care, retirement, and if he lost those jobs, unemployment, workman's comp, and disability. We need to switch an economy to create a portable benefit system so that from the first dollar you make, and no matter what income stream, some portion of that income stream is set aside for benefit buckets that travel with you that you can aggregate throughout your working career. Second, I think we need to fundamentally change. This is something Marty has helped me think through. Fundamentally change the way we think about tax, accounting, and reporting treatment of investment in human beings. Right now, we have a tax, accounting, and reporting structure that disproportionately favors capital or disproportionately favors research and development over investment in human beings. And if we're going to take a lot of folks that may not have traditional skills and continue to upskill them during their career, we're going to need to change that. So I would argue the current circumstance where a company can go out and spend $5,000 on a robot and get an R&D tax credit for that robot, have that robot count as an asset on your balance sheet, and that robot accrues to the overall value of your company, that's fine. But why shouldn't we at least treat, if a company spends $5,000 and takes two human beings, folks that may fall into this star category, take the skills they've already acquired, but also increase their skill structure so they become more efficient than the robot? Why shouldn't they get the same tax treatment? So I've created an R&D tax credit to focus on human capital development. I think we need to recognize that public companies ought to report their investment in human capital, and the SEC started down that path. And I even think we need to grapple with the accounting industry to think about investment in human beings as an asset class that can be reflected on the balance sheet. And then finally, the topic I touched on at the outset, and that is to have a meaningful conversation. And Accenture has been one of the leaders on this, to realize that if we move from the current enormous focus on shareholder capitalism back to what I think could be a broader-based, more inclusive form of capitalism, stakeholder capitalism, that could end up inuring to all our benefit. It says, still make money for your shareholder, but also do well by your employee and your community. And I want to commend not only Accenture's work, but the whole Business Roundtable in terms of raising these issues. Now they put the letter out. We need to make sure that that letter comes with actual structural changes, and that's going to require legislative as well as corporate action. And I look forward to working with the folks in this room and the folks who are watching this webcast to see how we can make that part of the agenda, particularly as we go into this presidential election season and hopefully afterwards. Again, my thanks to all of you who put together this incredibly important report. I want to make sure, again, I share it with my colleagues, and my apologies for the old talking and running. We've got some votes up on the floor right now that actually may be more meaningful than a lot of what the Senate's done over the last few months. So thank you again very much, and thanks for having me.